He was just filling up his old pickup truck when 5 bikers surrounded him at the gas station. "Wrong place, old man," they said before the first punch landed. The 84-year-old veteran hit the concrete hard, but when his shirt tore open, revealing a faded Navy SEAL Trident tattoo, everything changed. Because 30 minutes later, the sound of Black Hawk rotors filled the sky, and his SEAL brothers came looking for answers. If you believe some bonds can never be broken, and some uniforms never truly come off, stay with us because this story will remind you why you should never underestimate the quiet strength of an American hero. Harold "Ghost" Morrison had been invisible for most of his retirement. At 84, he moved through the world like smoke, present but unnoticed, purposeful but unremarkable. That Tuesday night at Murphy's gas station on Route 9, he was doing what he'd done every Tuesday for the past 12 years, filling up his 1997 Ford pickup and preparing for the drive home. Harold had served 28 years with the Navy SEALs, most of it classified, all of it dangerous. 3 tours in Vietnam, 2 in Panama, operations in places that didn't exist on official maps. He'd earned a Navy Cross for single-handedly extracting 12 POWs from a Viet Cong compound, 2 Silver Stars for classified operations. More Purple Hearts than he liked to count. But tonight he was just an old man in worn jeans and a flannel shirt, trying to pump $15 of gas without his arthritis acting up. That's when the Harley-Davidsons rumbled into the station. 5 bikes, 5 riders in leather vests with patches that spoke of violence and territory. The devil's disciples, according to the rockers on their backs. They weren't local. Harold would have known. These were travelers, probably running drugs or weapons between cities, stopping for gas and whatever trouble they could find. The leader, a mountain of a man named Jake "Bones" Sullivan, swung off his bike and surveyed the nearly empty station. He was having the worst week of his criminal career. A drug deal had gone bad, half his crew was in jail, and he needed someone to take his frustration out on. His crew consisted of 4 other devil's disciples: Tommy Razor Martinez, Danny Pitbull Chen, Marcus Sledge Johnson, and Kevin Tweaker Walsh. They weren't just looking for entertainment, they were looking for someone to blame for their trouble. His eyes landed on Harold, and something ugly sparked in his expression. "Well, well," he called to his crew. "Look what we got here. Old Timer thinks he owns the place." Harold hadn't said a word, hadn't even looked in their direction. He was focused on the gas pump, willing it to move faster, already sensing the shift in atmosphere that meant trouble was coming. His training kicked in automatically. Assess the threat, identify escape routes, calculate odds. 5 armed men, probably carrying knives if not guns. 1 exit besides his truck. No backup. No weapons except his hands and whatever improvisable items he could find. At 30, those odds wouldn't have concerned him. At 50, they would have been manageable. At 84, with arthritis in his joints and a heart that had already survived 2 minor attacks, they were problematic. But Harold had learned something during his decades in uniform. Sometimes the best way to win a fight is not to have it at all. The pump clicked off. $15 exactly, just like always. Harold had calculated the precise amount needed to get home with a small reserve, the habit of a man who'd learned to make every resource count. He replaced the nozzle carefully, screwed on his gas cap, and reached for his keys, moving with deliberate calm despite the predators circling closer. But here's what made this Tuesday night different from every other quiet evening Harold had lived through. The bikers weren't just looking for entertainment. Jake Sullivan was carrying the weight of failure, the shame of running while his men were captured. In the biker world, respect was currency, and he'd been spending it faster than he could earn it. Taking down a helpless old man might not restore his reputation, but it would make him feel powerful again, if only for a few minutes. The gas station itself had become a crossroads for trouble. Located at the intersection of Route 9 and County Road 15, it was a natural stop for travelers, both legitimate and otherwise. The owner, Sam Murphy, was 67 years old and had been running the place for 30 years. He'd seen his share of violence over the decades, enough to install bulletproof glass around the cash register and a silent alarm that connected directly to the county sheriff's office. Tonight, Sam was home with his granddaughter, watching a baseball game. The kid working the register was Marcus Johnson, no relation to the biker with the same last name, a 19-year-old community college student who'd taken the night shift to pay for textbooks. Marcus had heard stories about the dangerous customers who sometimes rolled through, but he'd never experienced it firsthand. That was about to change. "Hey, old man," the leader shouted, walking closer. "I'm talking to you." Harold finished filling his tank, replaced the nozzle, and screwed on his gas cap with deliberate calm. 40 years of civilian life had taught him that most confrontations could be avoided with patience and politeness. "Evening," he said simply, not making eye contact, reaching for his keys. "Evening." The biker stepped closer, his 4 friends flanking him in a practiced formation. "That's it? No, sir. No respect?" Harold paused, his hand on the truck door handle. These men were looking for a fight, and he'd seen this pattern before. Predators who escalated situations until violence became inevitable. The smart play was to get in his truck and drive away. But Harold was thinking about Marcus behind the bulletproof glass, just a kid trying to pay for college. About the other elderly residents who might encounter these men when Harold wasn't there to absorb their violence. Sometimes retreat wasn't an option. "Didn't mean any disrespect," Harold said quietly. "Just trying to get home." The leader laughed, a sound like gravel in a cement mixer. "Home? You mean that old folks' home where they keep all the useless old-timers?" His friends joined in the laughter, circling Harold's truck like wolves around wounded prey. The gas station attendant, a teenager behind bulletproof glass, was already reaching for his phone to call the police. But Harold knew the police were 20 minutes away on a good night, and this wouldn't wait. "Please," Harold said, still calm, still controlled. "I don't want any trouble." That was his first mistake. In the biker's world, pleading was blood in the water. Trouble? The leader stepped close enough that Harold could smell the beer and marijuana on his breath. "Old man, you don't even know what trouble looks like." That's when the first punch came. Harold saw it coming. His reflexes weren't what they'd been at 30, but 3 decades of combat training doesn't disappear overnight. He tried to duck, but his arthritic knee betrayed him, and the massive fist caught him in the temple. The world exploded into stars and pain. Harold hit the concrete hard, his 84-year-old bones protesting the impact with a symphony of aches and sharp twinges. But what hurt more than the physical pain was the laughter that followed, the sound of men who enjoyed inflicting suffering on those who couldn't fight back. The pavement was cold against his cheek, rough concrete that scraped his weathered skin. Harold tasted blood. His lip had split against his teeth from the impact. His left shoulder, which had been dislocated by shrapnel in Panama 35 years ago, flared with familiar fire. But beneath the physical pain, his mind remained sharp, analytical. He was cataloging injuries, assessing capabilities, running through options with the methodical precision that had kept him alive in far more dangerous situations. From his position on the ground, Harold could see Marcus through the bulletproof glass, the kid's face pressed against the window in horror. The teenager was reaching for something, probably the phone to call 911. Harold hoped he was fast enough, but he knew help was at least 20 minutes away. A lot could happen in 20 minutes. "Not so tough now, are you, Grandpa?" Jake Sullivan's voice seemed to come from very far away, though Harold knew the man was standing right over him. The biker's steel-toed boot connected with Harold's ribs, not hard enough to break bones. These men were experienced at inflicting pain without leaving evidence that would bring serious police attention, but hard enough to make breathing difficult. Harold curled into a defensive position, protecting his head and vital organs the way he'd been taught in SEAL training half a century ago. Survive, evade, resist, escape. The acronym still echoed in his mind even now. He could have fought back. Even at 84, muscle memory dies hard, and Harold remembered techniques that could disable or kill, pressure points that would drop a man instantly, strikes that could crush a larynx or stop a heart. But these weren't enemy combatants in a war zone. They were just angry, desperate men who didn't understand the difference between strength and cruelty. And Harold had spent too many years learning when not to fight, understanding that sometimes the greatest victory came through restraint rather than violence. But then one of them grabbed his shirt to lift him up for another round, and the worn fabric finally gave way. The tear ran from collar to hem, exposing Harold's chest and the tattoo that had been hidden beneath his flannel shirt for 40 years. It wasn't large or colorful, just black ink that had faded to blue-gray with age, the way all tattoos do when they've been worn for decades. A Navy SEAL Trident, the symbol that marked Harold as one of the most elite warriors America had ever produced. But this wasn't a modern tattoo, crisp and detailed. This was old-school work, done by hand in a tattoo parlor in Coronado in 1962, when Harold had first earned the right to wear the trident. Surrounding the central symbol were dates that told the story of Harold's service. Below the trident, in smaller script that had blurred slightly with age, Team 2, Team 4, Team 6. But what made the bikers' blood run cold was what appeared beneath those unit designations, a series of small hash marks, like a prisoner counting days on a cell wall. Except these weren't days, they were confirmed kills, marked in the traditional way that SEALs had once used to track their deadliest work. The marks stopped at 47. Marcus Sledge released Harold's torn shirt and stepped back like he'd been burned. He'd seen military ink before. Half his crew had Marine or Army tattoos, from their younger days before they'd chosen the outlaw life. But this was different. This had weight, history, the kind of significance that even street thugs understood. "Holy shit," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of traffic on Route 9. "Guys, look at this." But Jake Sullivan wasn't interested in looking. The last 3 days had been a nightmare of humiliation and failure, and his need to dominate something, anything, overrode whatever common sense he might have possessed. He was interested in finishing what they'd started, in proving to his crew that he was still the alpha, still the man they should fear and follow. "I don't care if he was Rambo," he snarled, spittle flying from his lips as his face flushed red with rage and chemicals. "Old bastard still needs to learn some respect. Time to teach this Vietnam washout what happens when you don't show proper appreciation for your betters." He drew back his boot for another kick, but Harold's voice stopped him cold. The tone had changed completely. Not threatening, not angry, just absolutely certain, like a man stating an immutable fact about the laws of physics. "You might want to think about that," Harold said quietly, rolling to his side and pushing himself up on one elbow. Blood ran from a cut above his left eye where his head had hit the pavement, but his voice was steady as granite bedrock. "That tattoo means I have friends, and they don't like it when people hurt their brothers." The leader hesitated. Something in the old man's tone had changed. Not threatening, just certain, like he was stating a fact about gravity or the weather. "Friends?" The leader forced a laugh. "What friends? You're 80 years old." Harold reached into his torn shirt pocket and pulled out a cell phone. Not a smartphone, just an old flip phone with a cracked screen and worn buttons. With deliberate care, he opened it and pressed a single speed dial number. The call connected on the first ring. "Eagle Base, this is Ghost," Harold said simply. "I need extraction." He gave his location, described the situation in military terminology that meant nothing to the bikers but everything to whoever was listening. Then he closed the phone and looked up at his attackers. "You have about 30 minutes, he said calmly. "I suggest you use them wisely." The bikers looked at each other uncertainly. The leader's confidence was wavering, but his pride wouldn't let him back down in front of his crew. 30 minutes for what, old man?" Harold used his truck to pull himself to his feet, wincing as his ribs protested. His shirt hung in tatters, but the tattoo on his chest seemed to glow in the station's fluorescent lights. "For them to get here," he said simply. 28 minutes later, the sound started. It began as a distant rumble, barely audible over the highway traffic. Then it grew deeper, more rhythmic, unmistakably mechanical. The teenage gas station attendant looked up from his magazine, frowning. The bikers, who'd been standing around making jokes and trying to convince themselves they weren't worried, went quiet. Harold, leaning against his truck and dabbing blood from his split lip with a paper towel, just nodded. "Right on time," he murmured. The rumble became a roar, then a thunder that shook the windows of the gas station mini-mart. From the north came the unmistakable silhouette of a Black Hawk helicopter, flying low and fast, navigation lights cutting through the darkness like angry stars. But it wasn't alone. A second Black Hawk appeared from the south, and a third from the west. They converged on Murphy's gas station with military precision, their rotor wash sending trash and dust swirling in mini tornadoes. The sound was overwhelming, a physical force that pressed against chests and made rational thought impossible. The bikers stood frozen, finally understanding that they'd made a catastrophic error in judgment. Before the helicopters even landed, ground vehicles were arriving. 3 black SUVs with government plates, moving in formation, their headlights cutting through the rotor-kicked dust like searchlights. They formed a perimeter around the gas station, doors opening in unison, figures in tactical gear emerging with the fluid coordination of a well-rehearsed operation. Harold straightened up as the lead Black Hawk touched down in the station's parking lot. The man who stepped out wore no uniform, but his bearing screamed military: broad shoulders, scarred hands, eyes that missed nothing. He was younger than Harold, but not by much, maybe 60. With gray threading his close-cropped hair, he walked directly to Harold, ignoring the bikers completely. "Ghost," he said simply, clasping Harold's shoulder. "Heard you ran into some trouble." "Nothing I couldn't handle, Hammer," Harold replied, using the man's call sign from 40 years ago. "But I figured you boys might want to meet my new friends." Commander Frank Hammer Rodriguez, currently assigned to Naval Special Warfare Development Group, looked at the 5 bikers with the expression of a man examining something unpleasant on his shoe. "These the ones who put hands on you?" Harold nodded. "The big one there seems to be their leader." Rodriguez walked over to the biker leader, who was doing his best to look tough despite the fact that he was surrounded by enough firepower to level a city block. "You know who you just assaulted?" Rodriguez asked conversationally. The biker's bravado cracked slightly. "Look, man, we didn't know." "Harold Morrison," Rodriguez continued as if the man hadn't spoken. "Call sign Ghost, 28 years, Navy SEALs, 3 Navy Crosses, 5 Silver Stars, 8 Purple Heart. Participant in Operation Eagle Claw, Operation Urgent Fury, Operation Just Cause, and about 50 other missions that are still classified." He paused, letting that sink in. "The man you just beat up and called worthless has killed more enemy combatants than you have brain cells. He's saved more American lives than you'll meet in your entire existence. And he did it all while asking for nothing in return except the chance to serve his country." The biker leader's face had gone pale. His crew looked like they wanted to disappear into the pavement. Rodriguez smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. "Now here's what's going to happen. You're going to get on your bikes and ride away. You're going to ride very far away, and you're never going to come back to this part of the state. Because if I ever hear that you've bothered another veteran, any veteran, I'm going to take it personally." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting. "And trust me, you don't want me to take it personally." The bikers didn't need to be told twice. They mounted their Harleys with shaking hands, started their engines, and roared out of the gas station lot like they were being chased by demons. Which in a way they were. As the sound of their bikes faded into the distance, Rodriguez turned back to Harold. "You okay, Ghost? Need a medic?" Harold shook his head. "I'm fine. Just a few bruises. At my age, I get those from sleeping wrong." Rodriguez wasn't fooled by the casual tone. He'd seen the security footage from the gas station cameras, watched 5 men attack an 84-year-old veteran who'd done nothing to provoke them. The sight had awakened something in him that had been sleeping since his last combat deployment. "This never should have happened," he said quietly. "No," Harold agreed, "but it did. And now those boys know better." The other SEALs were already packing up, the Black Hawks spooling up for departure. The operation had taken less than 15 minutes from arrival to resolution. A textbook example of overwhelming force applied with surgical precision. But before they left, something unexpected happened. The teenage gas station attendant, who'd been watching the entire scene from behind his bulletproof glass, opened his window and called out, "Mr. Morrison?" Harold looked up, surprised. He'd been coming to this station for 12 years, but the kid had never said more than $12.50 when taking payment for gas. "Yes? I just wanted to say thank you. For your service, I mean." "I had no idea," Harold smiled, the first genuine expression of warmth he'd shown all night. "You didn't need to know, son. That's the point. We serve so people like you don't have to think about it." The kid nodded, clearly moved. "Your gas is on me tonight, sir. And every night from now on." Harold started to protest, but Rodriguez put a hand on his arm. "Let him," he said quietly. "Some people need to give back when they learn the truth." As the Black Hawks lifted off and disappeared into the night sky, Harold found himself alone at the gas station, with his battered truck and his torn shirt. He looked down at his exposed tattoo, the mark he'd kept hidden for 40 years, not out of shame but out of humility. Maybe it was time to stop hiding. He drove home slowly, windows down, letting the cool night air wash over him. When he arrived at his apartment, he found Mrs. Chen from the apartment next door waiting on the front steps. "Harold," she said, concern evident in her voice, "I heard helicopters. Are you all right?" Mrs. Chen was 76, a widow who'd immigrated from Vietnam 50 years ago. She'd been Harold's neighbor for 8 years, and they'd developed the kind of friendship that required few words but deep understanding. "I'm fine, Mrs. Chen. Just had a little excitement tonight." She looked at his torn shirt, the bruises forming on his face, and shook her head. "Harold Morrison," she said sternly, "you are a terrible liar. Despite everything." Harold laughed. "Yes, ma'am. I suppose I am." The next morning, the story was all over the local news. "Elderly veteran assaulted at gas station, military responds." The reporter mentioned Harold's name, his service record, and the dramatic arrival of the SEAL team. Suddenly the man who'd been invisible for 40 years was very visible indeed. Harold's phone, the same old flip phone he'd used to call for help, started ringing. Neighbors he'd never met, veterans from 3 counties over, a producer from a national news show, a publisher interested in his life story. He turned off the phone and went for a walk. At Murphy's gas station, someone had left flowers by pump number 4. The one Harold had been using when the bikers attacked him. There was a note, "Thank you for your service," from a grateful American. More flowers appeared throughout the day, and food, and letters. The teenage attendant, his name was Marcus, Harold learned, had started a fund to repair Harold's torn shirt. It raised $3,000 in 6 hours, all of which Harold donated to a local veterans shelter. But the most meaningful visitor came that evening. Rodriguez showed up alone, out of uniform, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the diner down the street. "Figured you might want to talk," he said simply. They sat on Harold's front steps, 2 old warriors watching the sun set over a quiet street in a peaceful town that most people took for granted. "Ever regret it?" Rodriguez asked after a while. "The service, I mean. All those years in the shadows?" Harold considered the question, sipping his coffee and watching Mrs. Chen tend her small garden across the way. "No," he said finally. "Yesterday I might have. But not today." "Why?" "Because yesterday, those 5 men thought veterans were useless old-timers taking up space. Today, they know better, and maybe that matters." Rodriguez nodded. "Maybe it does." They finished their coffee in comfortable silence. 2 brothers in arms who understood that some battles were worth fighting, especially when nobody was watching. Later that night, Harold took out his sewing kit and carefully repaired his flannel shirt, but he left it unbuttoned, so the tattoo on his chest remained visible. Not because he was proud, he'd always been proud, but because he was no longer hiding. After all, some uniforms never truly come off. They just wait patiently for the moment when they're needed most. If you believe respect isn't something you retire from, and that true warriors never stop serving, hit that like button and type GHOST in the comments. Subscribe to Navy SEAL Chronicles for more stories of quiet heroes who remind us that courage doesn't have an expiration date. Because the most dangerous enemies are the ones you never see coming, and the most valuable allies are the ones you'd never suspect. Some battles end, some wounds heal, but brotherhood is